Yeah.
Linda, you wanted to jump in and ask something.
Couldn't we just start with the plastic water bottles? Because nobody needs to drink bottled water. Like we all drank from taps when we were kids, didn't we?
Exactly. Yeah.
That'd be an easy one to knock out.
That has been the greatest marketing exercise of all time, isn't it? Because
It's
you go to
ridiculous.
the gym and, Morgan, you used to drink from the fountain. Now it's almost deemed an essential item, having a plastic water bottle.
Well, it's interesting through COVID, the amount of litter that was around on the street dramatically dropped because we weren't at home, we weren't making that casual undoing the top of a drink bottle and throwing the litter away on the ground or whatever.
Wouldn't it be interesting to see, sorry to interrupt, wouldn't it be interesting to see how much bottled water sales dropped during lockdown? Because I bet you nobody died of thirst, did they? Because they're all at home drinking from the tap. So maybe we can learn that habit again.
All right, well, thank you for being with us. Janine Brinsden there from Wastemans. I don't know, Morgan, what do you think? It's interesting, actually, Morgan. Look, about a year ago, it was actually, from July the 1st last year, single-use plastic bags were banned. And under the Act of 2008, the Waste Management Act, the same law can be used to ban single-use plastic bottles. But gosh, looking back, what a hoo-ha that that discussion was. People coming from all sides for and against plastic bags.
It was shocking. There were all kinds of crybabies thinking, oh no, what am I going to do without my plastic bags? But after 2 weeks, no one noticed and forgot that we ever had plastic bags in the first place. And I imagine that the very same thing would happen with plastic bottles. There would be people complaining for complaining's sake about what are they going to do without their plastic bottles in the bottom drawer. But after about 2 weeks, they'll forget that we ever used plastic bottles, and a glass pump bottle will seem totally normal to them. I expect that's what would happen. And I actually hope that the government would take that step. Yes, glass is kind of more energy intensive to use.
It is.
But the recycling rate, I think, for glass is a lot higher than it is for plastic. So that's an unequivocally good thing.
Imagine, though, Morgan and Linda, a truck full of glass bottles. Imagine the weight.
But most of it's the water that gets me, because the water is already available in the tap. So you don't need to be buying it. Like, you want to buy a bottle of Coke, by all means, get yourself a plastic bottle of that, but just cut the water out as a first step.
So what you're saying is that focus first, policy-wise, focus first on the water bottles.
Get shot of them. Sorry to water bottling manufacturers listening in right now. I've just killed your business. But nonetheless,
buy a drink bottle, everyone.
We never used to have bottled water.
No, we didn't. When did it come in? Do you know?
Well, since we've been adults.
No, the water, because it was
it can't
early
be that
90s, do you think? Very interesting.
A triumph of capitalism that have managed to market the most accessible resource in the world to us and make us pay $4.50 a bottle.
Well, it's more expensive than Coke, eh? That's the weird thing.
Now, by the way, here is the text of the day. Here is the text of the day, and it's a fantastic one. Where do Goldie's paintings sit in this discussion?
Terribly.
Do you think?
But then doesn't history is often on the wrong side of history, isn't it?
Where do they sit?
Aesthetically, of course, you can look at a Goldie and think, oh, that's very nice. But for the descendants of the people who he was representing, I think you would have a much different view of the integrity of Goldie, I think.
Yes.
Maybe it's all about economic gain, isn't it?
Linda, Helen and Morgan Godfrey, you've been wonderful. Thank you very much for your time. I'm Wallace Chapman. The Checkpoint is next. Come back tomorrow.
Whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E haere aki nei, your lives matter, your dreams matter. Former US President Barack Obama talks directly to young Americans of colour. His words of hope are stark contrast to Donald Trump's military talk. The charges ramped up against the US police officer accused of killing African-American man George Floyd, and the 3 cops who stood by have now also been charged. But mass protests continue. Back home, a cave adventure company is identified as a strategic tourism asset. The title's worth $4 million to them. Migrant workers swamp Queenstown's new welfare centre, desperate for help. And the Blues get Carter for loose change, in rugby terms at least.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora ko Susana Leata tēnei. Thousands of people have continued to rally in cities across the US for the 9th night to demonstrate against the killing of George Floyd last week. The ABC's David Lipson has more.
I can't breathe. Large crowds gathered in Washington, New York and dozens of other cities as 3 more officers were charged over Mr Floyd's death. They face counts of aiding and abetting a murder, while the charge against Derek Chauvin, the officer who knelt on Mr Floyd's neck for almost 10 minutes, has been elevated to second-degree murder. The Floyd family has called the move a significant step in the road to justice. Meanwhile, former US President Barack Obama says the movement is an opportunity to bring about police reform and tackle racism in the United States.
David Lipson reporting. The Justice Minister is playing down any coalition tensions after New Zealand First's comments about a deal struck over commercial rents. After 2 months of wrangling, some tenants and landlords can now go into compulsory arbitration if they can't negotiate a fair price. Here's our political editor, Jane Patterson.
New Zealand First is talking publicly about disagreements along the way, saying it refused to back Labour's original proposal, as it would have included all existing lease arrangements. The Minister Andrew Little brushed off the criticisms as political posturing in the run-up to the election. He had some harsh words of his own, saying early on New Zealand First said it would present an alternative, which arrived on Friday afternoon. But he says that only survived a day as it was, quote, pretty embarrassing, and they went from there to come to an agreement. From Parliament, Jane Patterson.
The family of a man who died in custody at Hawera Police Station last year say they hope lessons will be learned. 3 officers have now been charged with manslaughter over the death in June. The officers are accused of failing to provide necessary medical care to the 55-year-old who had been arrested for assault following a family harm call-out. His older sister says medical assistance should be given for vulnerable people held in police cells.
I'm a nurse, and I think anyone that would be non-responsive, that you would seek medical advice anyway.
She says police could also have done more to keep the family informed about the investigation following her brother's death. The Tourism Minister says it's far too early to be speculating on exactly when a Trans-Tasman bubble could be underway. Business leaders in both countries have proposed a trial run which would see flights between Wellington and Canberra take off by July. Canberra Airport today opened a register of interest for the first flights, but the plan has yet to get sign-off by Kiwi or Australian authorities. Calvin Davis says such a move is premature.
Look, I don't think speculation helps people. I'd hate for businesses to make decisions based on speculation and then for whatever reason things can't happen. So, it's best that when we have a decision to make that we make it.
Tourism Minister Calvin Davis. Air New Zealand says it will only resume Trans-Tasman flights when borders are open and with the backing of both governments. Air New Zealand is resuming more domestic flight routes. The routes between Timaru and Wellington and Taupo and Auckland resume on Monday. The Invercargill to Auckland A320 jet service will operate 4 return services a week early next month. Routes between Invercargill and Wellington, Christchurch and Rotorua and Christchurch and New Plymouth will also reopen. It will take years for the Queenstown Lakes District to recover economically from the COVID-19 pandemic, even after overseas tourists return. Early modelling from Infometrics shows the district's economy may drop by almost a quarter, and more than 7,000 jobs may be lost in the next year. And up to 10,000 jobs are estimated to have been lost after the visitor economy dried up. Mayor Jim Bold says the report is bleak, but the council is already working on improving things. Schools have reported near normal attendance for their second week back after the lockdown. The Education Ministry says on most days last week more than 88% of students were in class. Our education correspondent John Gerritsen reports.
The ministry says for 3 days last week attendance was at nearly 89%. For the remaining 2 days, the Monday and Friday, it was at 86 and 85%. The figures are an improvement on the first day of school after the lockdown, when about 80% of students attended class. The ministry had been worried truancy would increase following the lockdown. Principals have told RNZ some students stayed away to protect older family members. The figures show attendance was highest in the South Island. Ko John Gerritsen, TNA.
It's coming up to 5 minutes past 5. The former All Blacks first five, Dan Carter, says he's enjoyed his first day as a member of the Blues. The two-time Rugby World Cup winner trained with his new team in Auckland this afternoon. Canterbury-born and a long-time member of the Crusaders, Carter admits pulling on a Blues jersey was an interesting experience.
It took a while to sort of put it on, but once I was out there training, just loved being out there again and kind of reminded me exactly what I was missing over the last 3 months.
Dan Carter. The Warriors are facing a 100-kilometre game day road trip to play the Panthers in their next NRL match in Campbelltown tomorrow night. Coach Stephen Kearney says the revamped competition has meant some unusual game day preparation, and they will stop off at the Parramatta Eels training ground to stretch their legs an hour into the journey. Thoroughbred racing is to resume earlier than anticipated, with the Counties Racing Club to hold a meeting on Saturday, June 20th. Racing was initially scheduled to resume in July. That's the news.
Consumerism.
Why should a limited number of people have additional risk with their money propping up an airline?
Nationalism.
I went down during the day and I was there for a tiny little short period of time, and it was much more for an inspection.
Athleticism. Past is forever, form is temporary. Is that what you said, Joe Porter?
That's right.
I've got no idea what that might mean.
It really does refer to you.
On account of the fact that I'm so old, get out of here, you whippersnapper.
Journalism. Morning Report, weekdays from 6, on air and online.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. For Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, showers about the ranges, a few spreading further east. Scattered rain developing in Hawke's Bay tomorrow morning, spreading to Gisborne in the evening. For the remainder of the North Island, also Bulla, Nelson and Marlborough, periods of rain, heavy at times with possible thunderstorms over western regions of the North Island. Rain easing and clearing in the south tomorrow morning and elsewhere during the afternoon and evening. For Canterbury, Otago and Southland, rain retreating to Canterbury tonight, then clearing everywhere tomorrow morning and becoming fine. However, a few showers remain about Banks Peninsula. Westland and Fiordland, fine spells increasing. Chatham Islands, today cloudy periods for a few showers, and a few showers tomorrow, rain heavy at times. RNZ National, it's coming up to 7.5 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Susanna, and welcome to Checkpoint. I'm Lisa Owen. After more than a week of protests, authorities in the United States have now laid charges against all 4 police officers involved in the death of the African-American man George Floyd. The murder charge against Derek Chauvin, the officer who knelt on Mr. Floyd's neck, has been upgraded to second-degree murder. It carries a maximum of 40 years in prison, and the 3 other officers have been charged with aiding and abetting murder. At the same time, President Trump's former Defence Secretary has launched a blistering attack on the Commander-in-Chief, and the man in the same post now has broken ranks to oppose the President. The ABC's Barbara Miller has the latest.
In 140 cities and counting, the protests continue. News that the charges against the police officer who knelt on George Floyd's neck until the 46-year-old could no longer protest have been upgraded, have not silenced the crowds.
No peace, but we break the police.
And they've been given these words of encouragement from former President Barack Obama.
You have the power to make things better, and you have helped to make the entire country feel as if this is something that's got to change. You've communicated a sense of urgency that is as powerful and as transformative as anything that I've seen in recent years.
The current president's threat that the military could be brought in to restore order does not appear to be supported by his Defence Secretary, Mark Esper.
The option to use active duty forces in a law enforcement role should only be used as a matter of last resort and only in the most urgent and dire of situations. We are not in one of those situations now. I do not support invoking the Insurrection Act.
Those comments are thought to have infuriated Donald Trump, whose press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, was quick to clarify that the president called the shots.
The Insurrection Act is a tool available. The president has the sole authority, and if needed, he will use it. But at this time, he's relying on surging the streets with National Guard. It's worked to great effect here in D.C. and in Minnesota as well.
And as for Mr. Esper's future in the role, Well, who knows?
As of right now, Secretary Esper is still Secretary Esper, and should the president lose faith, we will all learn about that in the future.
A previous Defence Secretary, James Mattis, has often been critical of his former boss, but his comments on the current situation have been his harshest yet. In a statement published in The Atlantic magazine, Jim Mattis criticised what he called the bizarre photo opportunity Donald Trump engaged in at a Washington church earlier this week, which saw the streets around the White House violently cleared. And he accused the president of sowing division. Donald Trump is the first president in my lifetime who does not try to unite the American people, does not even pretend to try, James Mattis said. We are witnessing the consequences of 3 years of this deliberate effort. We are witnessing the consequences of 3 years without mature leadership. And as if that wasn't enough, he went on to say, we can unite without him, drawing on the strengths inherent in our civil society. The charge against the police officer who knelt on George Floyd, Derek Chauvin, has now been elevated to second-degree murder. The other 3 officers involved in the arrest are now facing charges of aiding and abetting murder. A second-degree murder charge requires proof of intent to kill, and Minnesota's Attorney General Keith Ellison is warning securing a conviction won't be easy.
Let me be honest here. I mean, our country has under-prosecuted these matters in Minnesota and throughout the country. And so I think the trust is a result of historically not holding people who are public guardians accountable for their behavior in situations where we should have. So that, I think, is the origin of the trust problem. But we can't control the past. All we can do is take the case that we have in front of us right now and do our good faith best to bring justice to this situation, and we will.
Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison ending that report from the ABC's Barbara Miller. Our Washington correspondent is Jaguti Dave. I spoke to her just after midnight there, and she told me while the protests were more peaceful, people were continuing to defy curfews.
The barricades around Lafayette Park, which is surrounding the White House, they've been expanded to try and stop protesters from getting as close up. You can see military-style vehicles on the streets. You can see people, the National Guard and other law enforcement agencies, heavy presence on the streets of Washington, D.C. And there are protesters who are kneeling, who are chanting, "I can't breathe," who are chanting to the police to take their riot gear off because there aren't any riots happening here. And so often you see a lot of young people who are turning up to these protests. There were lots of families out and about in the afternoon as well. So yes, there has been some looting and damage to businesses here in D.C., but also you're seeing a lot of that in other cities like New York as well. But you're also seeing across the country peaceful protests happening where people are just protesting to demand racial justice for black people in America.
There was the announcement today that the 3 other police officers would be charged in relation to George Floyd's death, and also that the principal officer involved, that charge is being beefed up. Now, what was the reaction to that? Well, protesters were obviously calling for the other officers who were involved in George Floyd's arrest to be charged, and they're obviously pleased that that has happened, but what they want is much broader than the death of one African-American in police custody, and as tragic and terrible as any one death is one too many. But there have been so many African-Americans, unarmed African-Americans, who have died in police custody. And it's also not just about deaths in police custody, it's about much broader issues that black people in America have to face every single day. The inequality of opportunity, the inequality in issues like healthcare, which we've seen during the COVID-19 pandemic. There have been reports and studies done which show that minorities, in particular African-Americans, who are disproportionately affected
by the coronavirus in terms of catching the virus, but also dying from the virus. So all of these issues are snowballing into this broad call for justice that these protesters are asking for.
Has this turned into a protest against Donald Trump?
Well, a lot of people have been saying that really the injustices that black people face in the United States isn't just an issue with Donald Trump. It's not just an issue to do with the Republican Party. It's an issue that Democrats have to take responsibility for as well. So protesters are saying that this is, whilst a lot of the anger and a lot of the frustration has been levelled at the president's response, what has been seen as a heavy-handed response to these protests with the threats of mobilizing the military, which Republicans, people within his own administration, is disagreeing with him on this. Really, the issue is much broader. It's a kind of a crossing political lines.
So what do you think is going to calm the situation and see the streets clear again as this obviously bigger issue is dealt with, but the immediate confrontation on the streets and the protests, what is going to calm that?
Well, it seems that at least here in Washington, D.C., things have been calmer. In Brooklyn tonight, in New York, there have been confrontations between police and protesters, often quite sort of aggressive to look at. So it's difficult to see what exactly it is that is going to calm some of those altercations between the police and demonstrators. But protesters here, there's a feeling that there is a movement. There's a hope that this isn't going to fizzle out as previous protests have. You look at 2015 in Baltimore after the death of Freddie Gray in police custody, 2 weeks of riots, and protesters want substantial change to happen. And this is something that Barack Obama, he spoke for the first time on camera about these protests. And he also reflected that these protests feel different to the ones that have gone on before. He compared it to, there's comparisons that have been made to 68 protests in the 60s. And what he's saying is that there seems to be much more of a consensus in these protests, that the protesters look a lot more representative of the American public as a whole. It's seen that Black lives matter to all lives, to everyone. Everyone should care about Black lives. And so this is something that President Obama reflected on. And there is a hope that that is the case amongst activists as well, that this isn't something that's going to fizzle out, that these protests are going to mean something, that they're going to actually affect meaningful change to the lives of Black people in America.
That was interesting, wasn't it, that you had a former president in Barack Obama talking about your lives matter, your dreams matter, and he addressed that directly to young Americans of colour. In contrast to the speech that came from Donald Trump talking about sending thousands and thousands of armed military onto the streets to, well, dominate, to use his words.
Yes, that was a marked contrast between President Obama's words and President Trump's words. This is something that commentators have noted on. This is something that commentators have suggested that actually what the hope was that the president, when he gave that statement in the Rose Garden, that maybe he should have said something that was using the language of healing. At the SpaceX launch, he attempted something of that nature, but really his rhetoric suddenly changed back to this, the rhetoric of himself casting himself as the president of law and order. He wants to cast himself as a sort of Nixon-style president of law and order. That's what Richard Nixon did. He uses President Trump tweeted silent majority, another kind of emulating the rhetoric of Nixon, again sort of implying that the quiet majority support his policies and his approach. And the other former presidents have also come out. Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, a former Republican president. All of their language has been markedly different to Donald Trump's language. That's been noted by commentators observing those statements issued by former presidents. None of them have directly addressed President Trump, but the difference in the tone is very much noticeable.
And that was Jaguti Dave. And a short time ago, the Medical Examiner's Office released its full 20-page report into George Floyd's death. It says he suffered blunt force injuries to his forehead, face and upper lip, mucosal injuries inside his lips and blunt force injuries on his shoulders, hands, elbows and legs. It reveals George Floyd tested positive for coronavirus on April 3rd, and a nasal swab performed during his autopsy also came back positive. George Floyd suffered from heart disease and some narrowing of his arteries, although the report says his lungs appeared healthy and neither this or COVID-19 contributed to his death. There was also traces of methamphetamine and fentanyl in his blood. It is 5:20 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. We're keen to hear from you. Send us your feedback on anything you hear on the program this evening. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. The first information sessions at Queenstown's new welfare hub were fully booked within hours as migrant workers and residents try to figure out their futures. Local authorities have been grappling with thousands of welfare requests as job losses pile up. With a second wave of redundancies expected in the coming weeks, there are high hopes the centre can help ease the stress for many across the district. Reporter Tess Brunton was at the centre's opening day.
Priscilla moved to Queenstown 7 years ago to study before getting an internship, then a job in a local hotel. She worked her way through the ranks, getting a promotion before COVID-19 turned her world upside down and she was made redundant. Now she isn't sure if she can stay until her work-sponsored visa expires in December or has to return to the Fiji Islands when her subsidy payments finish later this month.
Suppose my 9 months has been wasted in this coronavirus. I could have earned, I could have done something, I could have get manager, I could have get residency if this thing didn't came, So that's why I just want to check with them if I can stay till December, and I'm pretty sure in this month something might change and I can get my job back and start all over again, yeah.
Immigration NZ staff will be at the hub at Queenstown's event centre for the next 3 weeks to provide information for migrant workers like Priscilla. She braved a cold and windy day with hopes a face-to-face meeting will have more success than her many attempts over the phone.
If we can have this advice just coming in or speaking with us, because we were in call for so many times and nobody picked up, we were not getting question being answered, and we are grateful that now you guys are here, we can talk and we can share our story, but just to, no one can be in anyone's shoes, but just to understand what we're going through, it's difficult.
The Keakaha Queenstown Lakes Community Hub didn't open to fanfare, but the first 4 information sessions organised this week were booked out within hours. It's offering information and advice on immigration, repatriation, employment, finance, wellbeing and welfare, with independent immigration advisors, local support services and advisors on deck to help people navigate a post-COVID world. Ex-Travels Victoria Keating wants to give people peace of mind if they're looking to return to their home country.
People are finding it particularly difficult at the moment because there's an awful lot of uncertainty. Certainly for people who have booked flights already, they may already have 2 or 3 tickets. And if airlines aren't giving refunds, they're only holding credits, you might have spent $7,000 trying to get home, and then all of a sudden your border's closed and you've got no way of getting home.
Queenstown resident Fiona went to the centre after being made redundant.
It was tough, and just getting your head around that you will be looking for work along with everyone else, and that the fact that there is going to be high unemployment.
She wants to find out about employment options and wellbeing support available. 3/4 of the people registering for welfare support are on employment or visitor visas. At its peak, up to 415 welfare calls were made a day during lockdown. The Community Hub's lead, Marie Day, says that slowed down to about 200 a day now.
So I think people should feel comfortable that they're coming into a safe space. We really want to make sure they're supported by a range of agencies in town. We've got staff from organisations like Salvation Army here to be advocates if people require that. We know it's challenging for people to come and talk about their situation.
She says more specific and additional information sessions and different speakers should be on offer next week, but the seminars are streamed online if they're fully booked. UK migrant worker Daisy was nervous to speak with immigration after being made redundant on a work-sponsored visa.
It's stressful, definitely stressful. Not knowing what we should do or what the best thing to do has been hard, I suppose, like sort of knowing that we should speak to immigration, but not being sure what's going to happen if we do. It's been pretty scary.
But Daisy says speaking to immigration staff in person put her mind at ease.
That they're not immediately deporting people, like they're going to give us time to do stuff, and as long as we're clear and open with them about what's happening, like no one's going to be sort of getting kicked out or getting into trouble for anything. They just want a dialogue to be happening between people and immigration. So that seems positive.
The local council and fundraising from the Wakatipu Community Foundation helped to foot the start-up costs, but Ms Day hopes to attract more funding support soon. For now, she says the centre is ready to support the community for at least the next month. In Queenstown for Checkpoint, Ko Tesbrunton, TNA.
The former All Blacks first five, Dan Carter, is officially part of the Blues. After initial reports last night sent the rugby world into a spin, the two-time World Cup winner trained with his new team for the first time today. Carter has joined the Auckland-based side as injury cover for Stephen Perifeta, who has a broken foot but won't be ready to play for several weeks. Clay Wilson and visual journalist Dan Cook were there as the Blues unveiled the All Black Centurion.
A sight Blues fans could scarcely believe. 5 World Rugby Player of the Year awards between them, Dan Carter and Beauden Barrett kicking it together at Blues training. Canterbury born and as red and black as they come, Carter admits pulling on his new colours for the first time was an interesting experience.
It took a while to sort of put it on, but once I was out there training, it was just loved being out there again, and kind of reminded me exactly what I was missing over the last 3 months.
For the Blues, the surprise signing is a right place, right time scenario. Back in Auckland after the COVID-19 pandemic ended his time with Japanese club Kobe, Carter was a free agent. Something Blues coach and former All Blacks and Crusaders teammate Leon MacDonald knew only too well when utility back Stephen Perifeta suffered a broken foot at training.
I think I got the timing right. I think I got him when he was sort of maybe coming out of lockdown and not quite thinking straight, and he's a man of his word, so he couldn't go back on it. So I think I might have hit the jackpot there.
It's not a jackpot MacDonald can cash in right away. While Carter doesn't look 38 years old and admits he's feeling fit, he's well aware he's only played 6 games in the last 18 months. MacDonald says fans shouldn't expect to see Carter on the field in the early rounds of Super Rugby Aotearoa.
We're 3 weeks into building up our progressions into contact, and he's day one, and had to sort of warm up the old hammies. So we've got to take our time to make sure we look after Dan. We need to progress him safely.
Outside of that, Carter's primary role over the next month will be as an off-field leader. Mentoring the Blues' young players is also a big part of what lured him to join the franchise. Sir Graham Henry, the former All Blacks and Blues coach, says the signing is a massive coup for the team.
I think it's marvellous. He'll add a huge amount of experience, obviously, but he's also been playing very well. He's been playing in Japan up to a few months ago, and according to his coach there, Wayne Smith, he was outstanding, even at 38. So I think it's very special.
Carter thinks the same. He also has the blessing of his father and staunch Cantabrian Neville, and another of those he holds dearest.
One of my sons was, realised that I'd finished playing in Japan, and he was absolutely over the moon that I was back home for good, and then he was asking if I'm retiring, and I said I'm not too sure. I haven't really thought too much about it. He's like, well, why don't you just go play for the Blues, but you're only allowed to play home games.
With everything coming together so quickly, the 38-year-old isn't even speculating about what lies beyond this short-term deal. But looking at Carter, it's impossible to rule out him continuing in some form. And with Dad Neville playing until the age of 40, there's no lack of motivation either. For Checkpoint, Clay Wilson.
And if you want to see Dan Carter in the blue jersey, you can see Clay's story online. We'll put it on our Facebook page and our website. Plans for a Trans-Tasman bubble by July have failed to get liftoff, with New Zealand ministers saying it's too early for such a proposal. Top business voices want to see a new flight between Canberra and Wellington in place within a month, but they may be overly hopeful. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Craig McCulloch.
Don't you just love those perfect little moments?
It may not be number one on your post-COVID holiday list.
Then you're going to love Canberra.
But Australia's capital could be your first chance for freedom. The Chamber of Commerce in Australia issued a proposal today for a new route between Wellington and Canberra, a trial run for the full Trans-Tasman bubble, and it wants the flight up and running by July the 1st.
It's a back-to-business flight, and it's about getting our countries moving again through tourism and trade.
John Hart, who chairs the Chamber, says the capital connection would operate for several weeks before being rolled out to other destinations around both countries. All passengers would be pre-tested for COVID-19 before boarding and would have to follow local rules and restrictions on arrival.
We want to make this happen.
The plan has the backing of both Auckland and Wellington's Chambers of Commerce, and Canberra Airport has gone as far as inviting tourists to register their interest for the initial flights.
We've had 35 people register in the first 15 minutes.
But that's where momentum appears to have stalled. For now, the proponents have yet to get any airlines on board. In fact, Air New Zealand says it has no intention of flying the route. Furthermore, they can't hit go without a sign-off from both governments. And in New Zealand, it's hardly been welcomed with open arms. The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern.
I don't want to raise expectations.
The Tourism Minister, Calvin Davis.
It's way too early to speculate on Trans-Tasman bubbles.
Even the Foreign Minister, Winston Peters, a vocal advocate for the Trans-Tasman bubble.
This is too early. It doesn't have the support of the Australian government at this point in time. Just as an aside, I wouldn't have thought Wellington and Canberra are the two best places to open up this flight, but never mind.
Ultimately, he says New Zealand is dependent on Australia's timeline.
Federal government in Australia has the right to determine who arrives in Australia, but once they land, that right goes to whatever state they're going to. And so it's complicated. We've got a much more simple system. So I think it's Australia we'll be waiting upon.
New Zealand will also be waiting for the all clear from health authorities. Having neared elimination of COVID-19 at home, scientists stress the borders are now the biggest risk for a second wave. And epidemiologist Michael Baker says opening up as soon as July sounds quite premature.
It's a big move to then start talking about increasing travel into New Zealand from countries that have not eliminated the virus. So I would say you'd pause for a very long time before agreeing to that, and you'd want to have a long list of conditions that are met.
We are all very eager. We're just eager to do it safely.
A panel of experts from both sides of the ditch is currently working up a separate and more comprehensive blueprint for a Trans-Tasman bubble. It's previously flagged September as a potential start date. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Craig McCulloch.
Coming up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, Discover Waitomo gets a $4 million funding boost. Tourism Minister Calvin Davis joins us. A German prisoner is a new suspect in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann in Portugal 13 years ago. And an admission from Sweden's top epidemiologist, the country may have been too laid back in its bid to curb COVID-19. We would love your feedback on the protests in the United States. Let us know what you think about a potential Trans-Tasman bubble. Is Canberra on your bucket list? And if you can go watch Dan Carter play at Level 1, would you? Text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or you can email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. It's time now, though, for the headlines with Susanna.
The Consumer Affairs Minister has asked Air New Zealand customers to show sympathy for the airline as it grapples with a high volume of demands for refunds. The national airline has faced backlash for only offering customers credits for flights cancelled due to the pandemic, saying it can't afford to refund everyone. Thousands of people are breaking curfews in the United States to continue a 9th night of protests as 3 more officers are charged over the death of George Floyd. They face counts of aiding and abetting a murder, while the charge against the officer who pressed his knee against Mr. Floyd's neck, Derek Chauvin, has been upgraded to second-degree murder. The New Zealand First Leader denies there was scrapping around the table with Labour over commercial rents, describing it as a robust exchange of ideas. After 2 months of wrangling between the two parties, some tenants and landlords can now go into compulsory arbitration if they can't negotiate a fair price. The sister of a man who died at Hawera police station last year hopes it will result in better communication with families involved in such tragedies. 3 officers have been charged with manslaughter over the death of the 55-year-old, who had been arrested for assault. His sister says police could have done more to keep the family informed about the investigation. The first information sessions at Queenstown's new welfare hub were fully booked within hours after opening today. Up to 10,000 jobs are estimated to have been lost during the lockdown as the district struggles to support thousands of residents and migrant workers. The Tourism Minister says it's far too early to be speculating on exactly when a Trans-Tasman bubble could be underway. Business leaders of both countries have proposed a trial run, which would see flights between Wellington and Canberra take off by July. Canberra Airport today opened a register of interest for the first flights, but Kelvin Davis says the move is premature. Those are the latest news headlines on RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susanna. If you're just tuning in, this is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. It's time to go to the business news with Nona Peltier now. Nona, so retailers, we've heard a bit about this in the news. Well, they're hoping that government-funded arbitration will solve some of the rental disputes that have popped up during the lockdown, obviously, and this is commercial enterprise here. How's it all going to work?
Well, for some retailers, it's going to be just in the nick of time because they've been trying to negotiate with landlords without much success. And it's not just one way, it's also the other way where big commercial property tenants have not been wanting to pay rent to landlords. So it's been on both sides of the equation. And what the government is acting to do here is offer up to $40 million. So that's a kitty, and up to $6,000 per arbitration. So I guess they're anticipating quite a few arbitrations coming along. And this is for companies or so businesses that have less than 20 employees and haven't already been able to make an agreement with their landlords.
Right.
So it's limited to people who still can't make any sense of things.
You have to have had a crack at it first.
You've had to have at least a crack at it and have been unsuccessful. So, well, this is effective from today. And what the government is hoping is that tenants and landlords will sit down and try and come up with a deal. If they can't make that deal, then go into that arbitration and then kind of strike something then. It's really about getting fair rents from people either because they can afford to pay them or because they can't afford to pay them.
It raises some interesting dilemmas because it is, in essence, renegotiating a contract, some people would argue.
Yeah, and that's probably one of the reasons why the government has had a hard time getting to this agreement. But on the other hand, it's an extraordinary time. So it's not something that is an everyday thing, and this is a temporary measure. Certainly it's going to run out eventually. And hopefully most retailers and landlords are going to come back. Business will be as usual when we get to level 1. Hopefully retailers will start seeing more people through their doors. Landlords will be able to see more of their businesses come back to business. Yeah, we'll see what happens.
And staying on the topic of property, really, Precinct Properties is going ahead with this construction of a large office building in the capital. Now, this is super interesting because a lot of businesses are saying that workers are not coming back into the city, that they're working from home. So why are they prepared to kind of give it a nudge anyway?
Well, Precinct Properties is a big commercial property development company. They have major investment in Bowen campus where this new development will take place. That's just adjacent to the Beehive. So you would think, gee, maybe why are they expecting government workers to come back? Well, actually, they're not. They've made deals with private enterprise, EY, which is a business consultancy accounting firm, maybe better known as Ernst & Young for some of our listeners, and Fujitsu, which is a equipment and service company providing services for business. Now, they're going to account for almost what's more than 70% of this office tower's leasable rental space. So they don't really have to find very much more to fill it all up. And the chief executive of Precinct Properties says they're already in talks with quite a few new tenants, and they're pretty much private enterprise that are going to fill this building. So they're saying, look, Wellington has very strong demand for good quality office space, and they're happy to build Tower 1. They're already working on Tower 2, which is the second phase of this development, and talking to potential tenants. And when I asked, they said that Auckland, where they're building developments in Wynyard Quarter and finishing up Commercial Bay, with that to be opening just very soon. That's the retail and the office tower, which I think is the tallest office building in New Zealand, right on the waterfront there at the bottom of Queen Street. They're saying that's it for now. They're not going to be building in Auckland until they can get some committed tenants. And at this stage, obviously, they don't have any. So they're definitely focusing on Wellington.
Interesting. And what else has been going on the markets today?
Yeah, okay, so incredible day on the market again. So we've risen 1% today, just about 1%, 105 points up to 11,223. Now, that's a level we haven't seen since that March 23rd announcement that we were moving to lockdown, which really sent the market into a deep dive. That's a third up on that point. That's like 33% up.
Is it people getting deals, looking for deals?
Probably more a fear factor of missing out on a deal.
Right.
Because it's not across the board. The rally isn't all the companies that are listed on the market. They're pick and choosing what they like. They're liking companies with export earning potential. And that includes your Fisher & Paykel, your A2 Milk. Less so the companies that have said that construction is what we just talked about. So Fletcher Building and not so much. And some others that look a little bit exposed. Sky City might be another. But look, the market is back to where it was basically at the end of last year. So it's almost like if you looked at your Kiwi Saver, you would have seen the levels are back to where they were at the beginning of the year. Interesting. And the dollar.
Yes.
Well, it's up slightly, but 64.2 US cents. So again, that's back to February levels. Now, that's not so good for exporters, mind you, but just a tad under 93 cents Australian, 51.2 British pence. So when we do get to travel again, it'll be good for tourists.
People will be watching the Aussie dollar in preparation for the bubble. Thanks, Nona. That's Nona Peltier with our business numbers and news. British police say they've got a significant new line of inquiry in the Madeleine McCann investigation. A German prisoner has been identified as a new suspect in the disappearance of the young British girl from a holiday resort in Portugal 13 years ago. The man, who's in his 40s now, is a convicted sex offender who had been living in the Algarve at the time, travelling around in a camper van. The ABC's David Sparks reports.
We're just hearing that a search is underway for a 3-year-old British girl.
It was a case that baffled authorities, horrified the public and intrigued the global media.
The girl's parents had gone to have dinner once their children were asleep.
If you have Madeleine, let her come home to her mummy, daddy, brother and sister.
An innocent girl disappears from a beautiful resort. Could Madeleine McCann still be alive?
Madeleine McCann would be 17 by now. She was on holiday with her family in Portugal in 2007 when her parents, Jerry and Kate, realised she was missing from the villa where they were staying. They'd left her sleeping while they ate at a nearby restaurant.
I went into the apartment and then I just noticed that the door was quite open. And that was when I kind of looked into the room and she's not in bed. And then I thought, maybe she's wandered through to our bed. So I went through to our bedroom and she wasn't there. And that was when I just knew that someone had taken her.
Now Scotland Yard says it's got a new lead, possibly the most significant yet. Detective Chief Inspector Mark Cranwell says they've identified a German man as a suspect.
He is a German national. He's white. He's about 6 foot in height. He's 43 now. At the time he was 30, but he could have looked aged somewhere between 25 and 32.
German police say the man, who has not been named, has 2 previous convictions for sexual contact with girls and is currently in prison. Detective Cranwell says the man was in and around the resort on Portugal's Algarve coast at the time Madeleine McCann disappeared.
We know the identity of this male. We have nominated him as a suspect. And he had access to 2 vehicles. What's significant about the 2 vehicles? The first one is a camper van. It's a VW T3 Westphalia model. It's an early 80s model, and the colour tone, it's quite distinctive. It's quite old and probably described as a bit beaten up, but it was not white upper body and a yellow sort of lower body.
He says the suspect first came to investigators' attention in 2017 and he's imploring anyone with information to come forward. This case and the mystery of what happened to the little girl at its centre has fascinated the world. It's still classified as a missing persons investigation because there's no definitive evidence as to whether the girl is dead or alive.
The ABC's David Sparks with that report. New Zealand First is flexing its muscles within the coalition, now publicly criticising some of the commercial rent measures its partner Labour had been pushing for, which it ended up blocking. After 2 months of wrangling, Labour and New Zealand First have reached agreement on how to help small businesses struggling to pay the rent. A temporary change to the law means from today, if tenants and landlords can't negotiate a fair price, they can go into compulsory arbitration. Here's our political editor, Jane Patterson.
Early on in the COVID response, the government moved relatively quickly to shore up support for residential tenants, but commercial rents have proved a much trickier beast. The Justice Minister, Andrew Little, acknowledged this has been a long, drawn-out process, but says there's now something in place.
There are a lot of tenants and landlords who have been holding on, waiting for a signal about what the government will do. We've always taken the view that in a situation like this, everybody's got to share the burden, everybody should share the pain. This package does that.
The deal may be done, but New Zealand First leader Winston Peters is looking to leverage as much political advantage as possible. He told reporters Labour's original proposal would have changed contract law for all existing lease arrangements, and so limits on the size of the business were imposed.
Look at those ones that need to be circumstances of fair treatment to both landlord and tenant. This is a very small minority, not the mass majority, where every contract was going to see the sanctity of the contract broken, and we said you can't do that.
He deflected questions about damage to the coalition relationship, saying it was part of good process.
You can call it scrapping, that may be your phrase, but making sure that wise, sound, practical, experienced ideas prevail, that's what I'd call it.
Andrew Little hit back, saying early on New Zealand First had promised an alternative, and that arrived on Friday afternoon.
It survived today, and even they withdrew it because it was pretty embarrassing. And then we've managed to reach agreement on the terms that we did, and I'm pleased we've got to this point.
But he brushed off questions about coalition tensions.
We're very close to election. Different parties, whether they're part of a coalition arrangement or not, are trying to stake out their position.
Leonie Freeman from the Property Council says it hasn't been a great process.
Where we are a little concerned about this is the time it's taken. There's been no consultation with the industry, and it's breaching sanctity of contract.
The founder of a property data software firm says providing arbitration probably won't make too much difference. Tom Wallace from the company Released says most landlords and tenants who've been able to come to some kind of agreement already have.
The majority already come to the table and already worked out an agreement because, we've been doing this now. We've been in this situation for 2 months. So it is fairly late. I don't see it having a major impact at this stage.
National's finance spokesperson Paul Goldsmith says small businesses having to wait so long and still without direct cash support for rent are the victims of coalition dysfunction.
National argued during the budget period that we should be getting cash into the hands of those small businesses, whether to use it on rent or any other costs that they've faced. The government didn't do that. And they've been very slow to deal with those day-to-day costs.
Now the budget is out of the way, New Zealand First is starting to seriously push against its senior coalition partner Labour. While Labour will campaign on its achievements in government, New Zealand First will want to show how and when it's been a moderating influence on the government. We've seen it with water reforms, with the move to level 1 and now with commercial rents. New Zealand First will be less worried about any accusations of coalition disunity than with pushing up its own profile as an independent party, with the election now less than 4 months away. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Jane Patterson.
It's 13 minutes to 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Let us know what you think of that new arbitration scheme. If you're a renter or a landlord at odds over your rent payments, do get in touch. You can text us on 2101. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Sweden's top epidemiologist has admitted that the country's laid-back strategy on tackling COVID-19 could have been improved. Anders Tegnell, who's been the public face of Sweden's virus response, defended the decision not to impose the strict lockdowns seen in other countries, but now says too many people have died.
One of the things is how easily it gets into the long-term care facilities, even easier than flu, which also gets into long-term care facilities, but not to the extent that the COVID-19 does. I think it's also a bit difficult to handle the uncertainty in how it spreads.
Sweden has more than 40,000 confirmed cases and 4,500 deaths, far greater than neighbouring Denmark, Norway and Finland. The BBC's Maddie Savage has more.
Well, for months we've been hearing him strongly defending Sweden's COVID-19 strategy to the rest of the world. He said its goal was slowing the spread of the virus with mostly voluntary measures like working from home, social distancing in restaurants, instead of the strict lockdowns that we saw in much of the world. He appears to have changed his tone a little bit this week. He told Swedish radio in an interview that perhaps in hindsight, measures somewhere in between Sweden's strategy and those stricter lockdowns might have been better. And he admitted that there was obviously a potential for improvement on what Sweden had done. But then he backtracked a bit at a news conference earlier, suggesting that some of those comments had been overinterpreted. He said he didn't think Sweden's overall strategy was flawed and that voluntary measures were working overall. He said he hadn't become more self-critical now than what he used to be. But I think what is crucial here is that he really has admitted that the death toll is larger than Swedish authorities expected, that there have been too many deaths too soon, more than 4,500 COVID victims here in Sweden now. And particularly there's been an admission that things have gone wrong in elderly care homes where there's been a very high death toll and intense debates here about a lack of protective equipment at the start of the crisis and the kind of treatment that's been available for residents.
And that's the BBC's Maddie Savage there. Last night we were inundated with feedback from you after our interview with Air New Zealand's Chief Revenue Officer, Cam Wallace. He told us the company could not afford to offer refunds to everyone affected by flight cancellations without dipping into its $900 million government loan. But that didn't wash with many of you. Some of you told us you don't think you'll be able to travel again or to the destination you had originally booked. Other listeners told us you can't see your credit and don't want credit in the names of people who won't be able to fly again. Do better is the message from Alexa Bell. She was forced to shell out hundreds of dollars for new flights, even though she has thousands in credit with the airline. After COVID-19 scuppered Alexa Bell's international trip, Air New Zealand refunded the section of her flights through America, but gave her a credit for the remaining $2,000 worth. She says while she would have preferred all her money back, she decided to take the government advice and support local business by shouting her family a trip to Queenstown using the Air New Zealand credit. But things got a little complicated.
So my husband and I decided we would go on a trip of a lifetime with the family and bring them all down to Queenstown in August. And we booked this really nice house, and we went online to book with Air New Zealand and realized we had to get a call, speak to a person to get this credit. Long story short is they told me that I'm the only one that can use the credit, and we'd have to pay cash for my husband and the rest of the family. We assumed that the 9 of us could use the credit and go down and have a, great holiday and help the economy.
So you've got this about $2,000 in credit, which you'd hoped to spend by shouting your family down to Queenstown. But it's
Correct.
a no. Even though it's your credit, it can only be used in your name for flights for you.
That's exactly right. So there's 6 adults, a child, and 2 infants. And we're all coming from all over the place. Well, we're in Kerry and they're in Auckland, and different dates and everything. And we just thought it would be such a great idea to use that credit up and really support Air New Zealand, because we really like Air New Zealand. They've always been fair and everything. And now we've had to actually buy those tickets for everyone else except me.
So how much did you have to shell out for the additional tickets?
Well, we're just looking through it now. I think it'd be about $400 per couple, and then with the children and stuff. I don't know exactly. We're just, because now the kids had to do it separately, and we're just tallying it up. But we would have used a chunk of that credit, and that was the whole point of the trip, was to, do what we've been told to do. Travel in New Zealand and help the economy.
What do you think about the fact that you can't use that credit across more than one passenger, and you can't use it in the way that you want to?
I'm just flabbergasted. The man I spoke to from Air New Zealand was really, really lovely, and he understood the dilemma. He just said his hands are tied. He did say that Air New Zealand is trying to rectify all the problems, but there are just so many of them that this is not one they're fixing right away. This is something that he's had to tell everybody, and he said that people are not happy. I'm just blown away that they can refund you easily on one ticket, but then not on another. It just doesn't make sense.
Has it changed the way you feel about Air New Zealand?
Oh, yeah. Look, I'm a Canadian New Zealander. I love New Zealand. I hope Air New Zealand is going to set this right. I believe they will. I really want to believe in it. I want to be positive. And anyway, who else am I going to fly with down there? That's a problem, isn't it?
Were you happy enough to get a credit, or did you actually want a refund on all the flights?
It would have been a lot easier to get a refund and just rebook. I did ask for that a few times, and it was impossible. But it was only after he said, look, you can only have the credit, that I said, okay, I'm going to book these next, 9 people. And he went, oh, sorry, you can only book yourself. And then I didn't lose my temper, but I thought that is wrong. And that's when I contacted you guys.
Okay, so what do you want to say to Air New Zealand, who potentially could be listening to this? What do you say to them?
You can do this, Air New Zealand. The technology's there. Work with the people and don't just keep their money in your coffers. You've got to sort this out. And like I said, I wasn't even saying give it back. I just wanted to use it properly. It's pretty simple. Pretty simple.
And that was Alexa Bell. Now, Checkpoint asked Air New Zealand if it would consider changing its policy to allow people to use their credits for others. Air New Zealand responded saying it offers flexibility in a small number of circumstances, usually for compassionate reasons. The British pub is an iconic part of the nation's life, a place to drink, socialise and unwind. So it has been tough for pub goers while their local has been shut because of coronavirus restrictions. But some pubs and pub goers have been responding creatively to the new rules, as the BBC's Paul Moss discovered.
There was already quite a queue when I arrived at the Princess of Wales, a pub in the north of London. There's only a takeaway service on offer here, but people were happy to wait in line just for the chance to get through the door of a pub, buy a drink and then leave.
It's weird, but it's the best substitute for what we can't get at the moment. So I think it's really important to have a beer, but I miss the pub a lot.
So you've got yourself a lager there. You could have bought that in the supermarket, a lot cheaper. What makes you want to come to a pub?
It tastes so much better from the tap than it does in a can.
Well, I managed to get inside the pub now. I'm at the front of the queue. They have a system here where you have one person serving either side of the bar so that there's only ever 2 customers inside at once. And I've got with me the manager here, Lawrence Santee. Lawrence, I've got to say I'm surprised how many people would turn up to a pub just to get a takeaway.
We've always been a very community-focused pub. So if it re-establishes what a pub's really about, that's actually a positive.
For some regular drinkers, the pain of missing the pub has clearly been too much. The beer writer and comedian Ben McFarland has been making use of pub takeaways, bringing drinks home, but then trying there to recreate that typical pub atmosphere with the assistance of his wife, Sophie.
A glass of overpriced white wine chilled at room temperature, please.
The second cheapest on the list.
That will be perfect.
There you go, my love.
It wasn't exactly clear whether Ben had descended into a full-blown fantasy existence. Either way, he insisted to me that being able to get his hands on pub takeaway drinks has proved something of a lifeline in these difficult times.
By taking a flagon, essentially, bring it back. We take turns to go to the fridge and get the beer as if we're buying rounds, and sometimes I surprise her by coming back with a packet of crisps in between my teeth. And then, of course, what we do at the end of the evening is we put the chairs on the table. I've bought a bell. At the end of the evening, we're going to bed. I ring the bell. My wife goes up to bed first. I close the door behind her and I say, just keep it down for the neighbours. So you really can recreate that pub experience.
And that was pub enthusiast Ben McFarland ending that report by the BBC's Paul Moss. Now, let's get to some of your feedback. This is about the Queenstown Welfare Hub. Now, that was where people can go and get advice after losing their jobs, and for particularly migrant workers. This person says, since the ski areas are short of staff due to no overseas workers coming in, maybe Queenstown workers who have been made redundant could be given employment there. Mount Ruapehu on the North Island ski field has said they will not be able to open all slopes due to staff shortages. This is a difficult time for all of us, not just the people in Queenstown, says Linda. That's interesting. So someone is suggesting that they transfer maybe some of the workers from Queenstown up to Mount Ruapehu, where there is a shortage of workers. Okay, on commercial rent measures. Now, this is the scheme that's been unveiled today, where businesses and renters who can't reach agreement on their commercial rent can go to arbitration. You'll know that a lot of people went on a rent strike during the lockdown because they say they weren't getting an income, so why should they pay rent? Arbitration scheme unveiled today. I think it's $6,000 that you can get per arbitration. This person says, I'm a commercial landlord. It's too little and too late. Nothing there. Very disappointing. And I've been taken advantage of by very savvy, well-advised, mainly offshore-owned companies who understand that the legal system is so expensive and slow that landlords would do what they could to avoid pursuing through the process in court.
RNZ News at 6. Ngā mihi nui ko Susana Leātawa tēnei. The Consumer Affairs Minister has asked Air New Zealand customers to show sympathy for the airline as it grapples with refund demands for flights cancelled because of the pandemic. The national carrier has given back money for some international flights where overseas law requires it, but has only offered credits for other tickets. Air New Zealand has apologised but says it can't afford to refund customers. Chris Farfoy says the airline is dealing with an extremely high number of customers who want their money back.
A little bit of sympathy there for them about the number of people that they're having to deal with. Again, they're in an interesting financial position themselves. I think at the end of the day, that's a decision for Air New Zealand to make, but they're in a difficult position like most other businesses at the moment.
Chris Farfoy, the Consumer Affairs Minister. The US President's former Defence Secretary James Mattis and his predecessor Barack Obama have both expressed their support for the protests demanding racial justice in America. Mr Mattis also denounced Mr Trump as divisive, as the BBC's Bernadette Keogh reports.
James Mattis has kept a discreet silence since resigning as Pentagon chief in 2018, which makes his sudden condemnation of President Trump all the more damning. He called on Americans to reject and hold accountable those in office who'd make a mockery of the Constitution. He said the United States was witnessing the consequences of 3 years without mature leadership, and that Donald Trump was the first president in his lifetime who didn't try to unite the American people.
Bernadette Keogh with that report. The New Zealand First Leader denies there was scrapping around the table with Labour over commercial rents. Rather, it was a robust exchange of ideas. National says some small businesses have gone to the wall while they waited for a government plan to help with the cost of commercial rents. After 2 months of wrangling between Labour and New Zealand First, some tenants and landlords can now go into compulsory arbitration if they can't negotiate a fair price. Winston Peters says the negotiations were about getting the best result.
You can call it scrapping, that may be your phrase, but making sure that wise, sound, practical, experienced ideas prevail, that's what I'd call it.
Winston Peters says he's not concerned about the coalition breaking down, as that would only happen if either party broke their word. The family of a man who died at Hawera police station last June say medical assistance should be a given for vulnerable people held in police cells. 3 officers have been charged with manslaughter following the death of the 55-year-old. They're accused of failing to provide necessary medical care to the intoxicated man, who had been arrested for assault as part of a family harm call-out. The man's older sister says she hopes lessons will be learned from the incident. The Australian-based woman says police could also have done more to keep the family informed about the investigation following her brother's death. The first information sessions at Queenstown's new welfare hub were fully booked within hours after opening today. The district is struggling with thousands of requests for support from residents and migrant workers. Up to 10,000 jobs are estimated to have been lost during the coronavirus lockdown. One migrant worker, Priscilla, says she isn't sure what she'll do after being made redundant.
A lot of rumours is around that maybe they will cancel our visa and after our last pay we have to go back or we can stay. So just want to come and cross-check with the advisors here that can we stay till December? Maybe things can go better, and with all this dedication and a huge amount of money spent on our study and things, investment on our time, can we stay here?
Priscilla, a migrant worker in Queenstown. Water restriction levels are being reduced in the far north from tomorrow following significant rain. Tough level 4 restrictions allowing for essential water use only in Kaikohe, Kawakawa and Rawene will be reduced to level 3. Businesses and households can now water gardens and wash cars, buildings and paved areas from a bucket. A ban remains on the use of all outdoor hoses, irrigation systems and filling swimming pools from council supplies. Level 3 restrictions in Opononi and Omapere will also be reduced to Level 2, allowing the use of handheld hoses and filling of swimming pools from the main supply. It's 4.5 minutes past 6. Dan Carter says those closest to him have given their blessing for him to join the Blues for Super Rugby Aotearoa. After the shock news of the 38-year-old's signing, the two-time World Cup winning All Black trained with his new team for the first time in Auckland today. Carter says he has the support of his father and staunch Cantabrian Neville, as well as another of those he holds dearest.
You know, one of my sons realised that I'd finished playing in Japan and he was absolutely over the moon that I was back home for good, and then he was asking if I'm retiring and I said I'm not too sure, I haven't really thought too much about it. He's like, well, why don't you just go play for the Blues, but you're only allowed to play home games.
Dan Carter. The British America's Cup challenger Enos Team UK are prepared to jump through whatever immigration hoops are necessary to get into the country to begin their build-up for the Auckland Regatta. While visas have been granted to overseas film crews working on the Avatar movie, America's Cup sailors still don't know when they can enter the country. Teams are worried they're missing out on precious build-up time, but Team UK skipper Sir Ben Ainsley says he understands the need for caution. That's the news.
I'm Catherine Ryan. On 9 to noon tomorrow, the challenges ahead for freshwater reforms and why the devil could be in the detail. Amanda Vincent, trailblazing seahorse expert and winner of the world's foremost award for animal conservation. The creative sector sells New Zealand as open for business. Grant Smithies with the Roulette's latest, a song woven together over the web. Join me on 9 to noon on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, showers about the ranges, a few spreading further east. Scattered rain developing in Hawke's Bay tomorrow morning, spreading to Gisborne in the evening. For the remainder of the North Island, also Bulla, Nelson and Marlborough, periods of rain, heavy at times with possible thunderstorms over western regions of the North Island. Rain easing and clearing in the south tomorrow morning and elsewhere during the afternoon and evening. For Canterbury, Otago and Southland, rain retreating to Canterbury tonight, then clearing everywhere tomorrow morning and becoming fine. However, a few showers remaining about Banks Peninsula. Westland and Fiordland, fine spells increasing. Chatham Islands today, cloudy periods and a few showers. Tomorrow, rain, heavy at times. RNZ National. It's coming up to 7 minutes past 6.
Thanks, Susanna, and kia ora anō. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. The Waikato business Discover Waitomo is the first to benefit from a government plan to protect so-called strategic tourism assets, with a $4 million grant to help it cushion the blow from COVID-19. The money is from the $400 million fund earmarked for a tourism sector recovery plan. It includes a scheme that identifies high-profile tourism operations that are key attractions for New Zealand that bring significant visitors to their region, along with widespread economic benefits. Discover Waitomo offers glowworm and caving tours, including blackwater rafting. And Tourism Minister Kelvin Davis announced its $4 million boost today, and he joins me now live. Good evening, Minister. Why Discover Waitomo for this money?
Well, they are a strategic tourism asset. They fit the criteria. Without them there, the region would well struggle. There's significant spillover benefits from Discover Waitomo into the local community. So, they fit the criteria, and we're very pleased to be able to support them. It's important that we do have a network of strategic tourism assets, because when international borders do reopen, we need to have these attractions open and available for visitors to enjoy, or else visitors would be coming here with nothing to do.
So how many jobs will it save at this particular operation?
This will save about 40 jobs, but the spillover benefits into the rest of the community may well save other jobs, and it's really important that people realise that this is not just about supporting an individual business, but also about the region and the community around them.
So, and what is the money being spent on?
Well, that's for them to...
Part of the application, though, Minister, they had to identify exactly what the money was going to be spent on. So did you see that part of their application?
No, so I haven't seen the application, but their application was recommended to myself and the other tourism recovery ministers, and so we were happy to support it. We know that it's going to create benefits for that particular region and for tourism across New Zealand in general.
Were they asked to apply? Because applications only opened today, so what process did they actually go through?
Yeah, so there is capacity for us as the tourism recovery ministers to hear urgent and ad hoc applications, and this fit the criteria. So, as I say, we were happy to support it.
So did they approach you before this scheme was even up and running?
Well, everyone, people knew that we had a strategic tourism assets program. They did approach us and, approached MB because they registered their interest when it was announced straight after the budget, and, the process has flowed on from there.
So had they exhausted every other financial avenue, which is also one of the criteria of the application?
Yeah, we're satisfied that they've met all the criteria in order to apply for this, and hence our satisfaction at that. We were happy to support them.
So how safe is the taxpayers' money in there? Because $4 million is not a small amount of money. So what are the obligations on that company as a result of getting that funding?
So they have to, they'll get the money every quarter. They need to make a quarterly declaration that they still need that money. So if the business thrives and goes gangbusters and they don't actually need the taxpayers' support anymore, then that money can be returned into the kitty to help other businesses.
So Grant Webster, who's the boss of Tourism Holdings that they own, Discover Waitomo, you're announced as your co-chair of the Tourism Futures Task Force. Is there any conflict of interest there? He's one of your co-chairs, and today his company is the first company to get money from this fund.
Well, look, the Tourism's Futures Task Force is about reimagining the future of tourism, and he has the leadership, the skills and the experience to work alongside his co-chair, Steve Chadwick, to make the right decisions about the future of tourism. So it had nothing to do with today's announcement.
So there's no conflict of interest, or no perceived conflict of interest?
No, I don't think so, because his business is one thing. That decision was made separately before we made the decision to appoint him as the co-chair.
Okay, because also part of the application process, the official application process that has gone up today, there's a box that you have to tick if there is a possible conflict of interest. Was that discussed before you granted the money?
Well, he wasn't appointed as the co-chair when the decision was made.
But was he a contender at that point?
Oh, there was a range of names in the mix, but the decision to appoint him as the co-chair along with Steve Chadwick was made after the decision to give them the $4 million to support their business.
How many other contenders were there for that job that he got?
Oh, there was a number. There was about a dozen.
Okay, so the application that you approved to be the first company to get money, I mean, how many others did you consider, how many other applications did you consider before choosing Discover Waitomo for the $4 million?
Well, there were at least two others. We would have liked to have made more announcements today, but unfortunately, due to bereavements with one member of a company, we couldn't do that today. So there are other companies that were hoping to make announcements, but they'll be made in the coming days.
So are there 2 other applications that have been approved?
There are a couple of other applications that have been approved, and there are more applications on the way.
And what value is going in funding to those 2 other companies?
Oh, look, I'm not going to announce that here and now with you, Lisa.
I understand you don't want to name the company, but can you just give us a ballpark figure? How much are they getting?
No, I'm not going to give you a ballpark figure, but what I will say is that each application is looked at upon its merits, and tailored solutions are made to the needs of each particular company.
So how much of that $400 million that's going into basically reviving tourism, how much is ring-fenced for these strategic assets?
Well, look, the bulk of it, so it was split into 2 parts. There's the Tourism Transitions Program, which will be a lesser part, but the strategic tourism assets, it's the bulk of the part. It depends on how many companies do apply and what their specific needs are. So we can't really put an exact figure on it, exactly how much will be used in the strategic tourism assets, because each company's needs will be different.
You must have had some projections though, so what are you anticipating of that $400 million? What are you going to put into strategic assets, roughly? What have you set aside?
Well, like I say, the bulk of it will go to the strategic tourism assets, but I'm not going to put an exact figure on it because it depends on the needs of each business.
So Discover Waitomo is quite a big entity, part of Tourism Holdings. You know, some of these big masthead assets, people anticipate that they will bounce back when we can get visitors. They're well-known operations. What about the smaller operators?
Well, it's about what is a strategic tourism asset, and smaller operators can be strategic tourism assets as well. So if they meet the criteria, then they meet the criteria, but you've got to remember that our initial response to COVID-19 with all the wage subsidies and the tax measures and that were there to support businesses throughout New Zealand, of which the tourism industry has accessed a few billion at the very least.
As has Waitomo. So the other 2 companies that you have approved, are they smaller operators?
Oh, look, I'm not going to get into the details about other companies, Lisa, because the announcements will be made as soon as we can make them. But every company has to pass the criteria, and we're satisfied that the other 2 companies have met the criteria necessary to be deemed a strategic tourism asset.
So did Discover Waitomo actually fill out an application form with all the required paperwork, the 2 years of profit and loss information and everything that is asked for in the official applications that just opened today?
Well, they would have gone through the process with the officials, and I'm confident that they've met all the criteria.
Another tourism-related story that we've been looking at is Air New Zealand. So have you spoken to them recently?
No, I haven't spoken to Air New Zealand. Grant Robertson is the minister responsible for Air New Zealand, so it would not be appropriate for me to tread on his toes.
Not even in your capacity as tourism minister, because obviously they're the ones flying people up and down the country.
Well, the thing is Grant Robertson is the minister who has direct responsibility, the shareholding minister, I think it's called, and it's just not appropriate for me to intervene on any of Air New Zealand's business.
Okay, so this Canberra bubble that's kind of been floated today, is that actually a goer, or is it someone just pushing the boat out? Because it seems that none of the official groups looking at the bubble are on board with this. What can you tell us?
Well, everybody, of course, would love to see a Trans-Tasman bubble as soon as possible, but that will take a lot of work on both sides of the Tasman, and of course it comes down to both governments being happy that it's safe for that bubble to occur. Now, I think it's not the Australian government that's been floating that idea, and it certainly hasn't been the New Zealand government. So I'm not really sure who is floating that boat. But it's something that we're working towards. But in terms of today's announcement, I'm not sure who's pushing it.
Okay, have you made any calls on it though? Because obviously Canberra has come out saying it's taking registrations for people who want to be on the fly.
Well, when you say Canberra, I don't think you're talking about the Australian government. And people are saying, what are we doing towards establishing a Trans-Tasman bubble, and can I put a date on it? The answer is, well, that would be inappropriate and wrong of me to speculate on a date, because businesses will be listening and they'll be wanting to make decisions based on speculation that may or may not prove accurate, because we just don't know.
But have we been planning for September?
Well, I'm not going to say that, Lisa. That's exactly the problem, is speculation like that will cause businesses to make decisions that may not prove accurate. I believe there's been another 8 COVID cases in Australia today, and if there are more cases over there, then that will set dates back even further, and businesses will have made decisions based on pure speculation. I think it's irresponsible.
Okay, so then it's July school holidays in New Zealand for people here then? Is that the deal?
Well, as I've said, and as we've said, that at the moment the travel restrictions have gone off on level 2, so domestic tourism is what it is. But again, any Trans-Tasman bubble will be at the agreement of both governments when both governments decide it is safe to travel.
Appreciate your time this evening. That is our Tourism Minister, Kelvin Davis. It is 19 minutes after 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. After more than a week of protests, authorities in the United States have now laid charges against all 4 police officers involved in the death of African-American man George Floyd. The murder charge against Derek Chauvin, the officer who knelt on Mr. Floyd's neck for more than 8 minutes, has been upgraded to second-degree murder. It carries a maximum of 40 years in prison, and the 3 other officers have been charged with aiding and abetting murder. It comes as tens of thousands of people defied curfews to stage peaceful protests around the country. And former President Barack Obama went public for the first time since protests began to offer his support. CNN's Miguel Maqueres reports.
A long-awaited decision for George Floyd's family and supporters.
George Floyd mattered. He was loved. His family was important. His life had value. And we will seek justice for him and for you, and we will find it.
Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison announcing charges for the former police officer who kneeled on George Floyd's neck, killing him, will be increased to second-degree murder. And the other 3 former officers who either helped hold Floyd down or stood by watching have been charged with aiding and abetting second-degree murder. Ellison asking for patience as they work through the process.
Trying this case will not be an easy thing. Winning a conviction will be hard. But history does show that there are clear challenges here.
Just hours earlier,
all the world is watching.
George Floyd's son stood at the spot where his father took his final breath.
I'm trying to get justice for my father. And no man or woman should be without their fathers.
We want justice.
And we want justice for what's going on right now.
Family attorney Benjamin Crump making a powerful statement that Floyd's death shines a light on inequality everywhere.
When George Floyd said, "I can't breathe," because when he couldn't breathe, none of us could breathe. And so this is a tipping point.
Earlier today, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz visited the same hallowed ground.
For me, I have to personally and viscerally feel this. I don't think we get another chance to fix this in the country. I really don't.
And as protesters take to the streets across the country today, last night's protest remained largely peaceful, but as curfews passed in some cities, there was once again unrest. CNN cameras were there as looting continued in New York and in Lafayette Park across from the White House, where after mostly peaceful protests, police used pepper spray through the fence directly at our camera.
Press.
But in many cities, protesters and police came together. In New Orleans, police officers took a knee with protesters. In Boston, too, and in Houston, a protester praying with the police chief.
Amen.
But as George Floyd's family continues to grieve,
she wanted to know how he died. And the only thing that I can tell is he couldn't breathe.
Their hope that his death will bring change.
Meanwhile, former US President Barack Obama has spoken publicly for the first time since George Floyd's death, saying that while the protests have been difficult and scary, they provide an opportunity for change. His address was part of a discussion hosted by My Brother's Keeper, a program Obama founded in 2014 after the police shooting of black teenager Michael Brown in Missouri. The comments were in stark contrast to President Trump, who has threatened to deploy the military on protesters. Obama said there was a change in mindset taking place and a push for America to do better.
In some ways, as tragic as these past few weeks have been, as difficult and scary and uncertain as they've been, they've also been an incredible opportunity for people to be awakened to some of these underlying trends. And they offer an opportunity for us to all work together to tackle them, to take them on, to change America and make it live up to its highest ideals. And part of what's made me so hopeful is the fact that so many young people have been galvanized and activated and motivated and mobilized.
Obama didn't mention Trump in his address, but appeared somewhat more presidential than the current US leader, speaking directly to young black Americans with a message of hope.
I want you to know that you matter. I want you to know that your lives matter, that your dreams matter. And when I go home and I look at the faces of my daughters, Sasha and Malia, and I look at my nephews and nieces, I see limitless potential that deserves to flourish and thrive. And you should be able to learn and make mistakes and live a life of joy without having to worry about what's going to happen when you walk to the store or go for a jog or are driving down the street or looking at some birds in a park.
He also implicitly rejected those like Trump who have focused criticism on the demonstrators, saying America was founded on protests in the American Revolution. Now, we've got a lot of feedback from you all on Air New Zealand again this evening. Sean has got in touch to say, I have a credit with Air New Zealand and intend to use it as soon as the bubble comes along. Then I will never use them again. Last part of that sentence, all in capital letters. People need to vote with their feet instead of supporting our national carrier that doesn't give a toss about us. We gave them $900 million. Minister Farfoy should be telling them what's expected. Someone else says, we hear a lot about Air New Zealand flights being cancelled, but what of those that have booked on other airlines? I have a flight booked with Virgin Australia leaving Dunedin. No media attention is given to those booked with other airlines. I can't see anyone advocating for us with or without credits. That is from Bronwyn. This one's interesting from Scotty. Scotty, you might be in a bit of a bind here. Scotty says, first time email, long time listener. I really do hope Air New Zealand sort out their flight fiasco, says Scotty, as I booked tickets to Auckland from Christchurch for 20 members of our cricket team. To go to the Bay of Islands. I really don't want several $1,000s in credit, says Scotty, and then have to pay all my friends back. Why does Air New Zealand have to make it so hard? Money is money. And this one says, why can't the Crown insist, as the majority shareholder, that Air New Zealand refund the tickets? It seems as though the 48% of shareholders are getting $1 billion, all expenses paid trip on a monopoly airline to the bank and probably in the Caymans. As the major shareholder with a bottomless pocket, the Crown can tell the freeloaders to cough up, says Peter. Thank you for all your feedback on that one. Let's go to the UK now, and Prince Charles says contracting the coronavirus has made him more determined to push and shout and prod. The heir to the British throne has called for nature to be put at the centre of decision-making. He warned that without learning from the pandemic, the world may face a similar threat in the future. The BBC's Johnny Diamond has the story.
The Great Reset, Prince Charles calls it, what he says is a golden opportunity to seize something good from the crisis. He has been, in his words, banging on about the importance of the environment for 4 decades. And now he says we have to find a way to put nature back at the centre of everything we do. We have exploited, dug up and cut down everything as if there was no tomorrow. We have, he says, exposed ourselves to the dangers of SARS, Ebola and now COVID-19 through the destruction of biodiversity.
We should have been treating the planet as if it was a patient long ago. So no self-respecting doctor would ever have let the situation, if the planet is a patient, reach this stage before making an intervention.
He says he was lucky with his own experience of COVID-19 and got away with it quite lightly. But he can understand what others have gone through. He feels particularly for those who have lost loved ones and have been unable to be with them. And he paid tribute to those in the National Health Service and other key workers.
And that was Johnny Diamond reporting. Now, a lot of you have been getting in touch with the interview that we've just done with Kelvin Davis, the Tourism Minister. This is about funding for strategic tourism assets. He announced the first company to get funding today. It is Discover Waitomo, and they're getting a $4 million grant to help cushion them against the blow of COVID-19. Alan has got in touch to say the Minister of Tourism was completely and utterly unable to provide a clear answer about funding strategic regional tourist assets. He couldn't even say what strategic means. Really, it's hardly worth interviewing him, says Alan. And someone else says, how can the government consider all applications equally when they have already started dishing out our money on the first day of applications when they've just opened? Sounds like they're picking winners. Actually, the first day of applications is today, and the Waitomo, Discover Waitomo application was put in prior to applications formally opening, as the Minister pointed out there. This one in says, any tourism business that is dependent for survival on an overseas tourism trade has a flawed business model. Less than 50% overseas has to be the standard for the future. More than 50% go to the war, this person says. A dumb, low-wage business. And who is going to pay all of this money back? Well, they don't have to pay it back. It is a grant. And also the Minister there wasn't able to tell us how much of the $400 million is actually going to secure those strategic assets. Thank you for your company this evening and all your feedback. That's all we've got time for tonight. The news team will keep you up to date this evening. And don't forget, First Up will be First Up tomorrow morning. Join them then.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. The sister of a man who died in Hawera police station last year says she hopes the court process will provide justice for her brother. The country's regional tourism organisations are the first to receive money from the government's $400 million recovery fund. The Prime Minister has brushed off criticisms from New Zealand First about a commercial rents policy Labour was pushing for. And China will allow foreign airlines to resume limited flights after a threat from the US to halt all flights by Chinese airlines. Those are the headlines. Our next news will be at 7.
Tonight on Nights, Paul Burrington brings us another chapter in the story of electronic music. Emmeline Part-Dahlstrom celebrates America's return to the space travel business with the successful launch of the SpaceX Dragon module, while Our Changing World finds Alison Ballance at one of the most southerly pianos in the world.